Hello, today's presentation is going to be on Formosa Plastics USA. It's a company that makes plastics. They make the raw form in terms of pellets or other sorts of plastics that are then shipped to other companies which turn them into everyday plastics. Could be using molds or other sorts of things, but basically they make the original plastic that ends up being our everyday plastic, car parts, water bottles, packaging, all that sort of stuff. The position of this paper is that the Formosa plastics pollution outweighs the positive economic impact of their plant. Their plant is very large. They do employ a lot of people, U.S. jobs. It's a very large site, 24,000 acres. It's located along the Lavaca Bay within the Texas Barrier Islands. That is why its pollution has a negative impact because of these freshwater brackish areas that then run into the sea. But the plant does offer a very high salary of $134 million every year to its employees and the contractors. So it does have a economic impact. It's a very small town surrounded by the plastics plant. This area right here is the actual town of Point Comfort, and everything else, this is the main plastics plant, and these are different areas that they use to contain their pollution of chemicals, where these are evaporation lakes in the area that they put the chemicals in so that they can evaporate off. The Texas Barrier Islands is an area that's very unique to its own. So freshwater rivers supply the bays, and the bays mix with the salt water, which allows for many different kinds of wildlife in terms of birds, fishes, all sorts of stuff. The environment-related fines that Point Comfort has had in the last few years is pretty significant. 35 environment-related fines by the EPA for a total of $19 million. That is just in the last 20 years. They lost a $50 million lawsuit due to their microplastics pollution. It was brought about by concerned citizens initially, and then it just basically turned into a very large case. Although they've had these two setbacks of $19 million and $50 million, the plant still operates, it still makes a lot of money. It has recently expanded operations with a $5 billion plant improvement. So, they're still doing pretty good in terms of profits, even though they have been sued and fined in the past. I believe the plastics plant should receive more pressure to run a cleaner operation, and that is the position that I'm taking. So, these are microplastics. They're small beads, really similar to what Formosa Plastics produces, and these would be the plastics that did not make the cut to be sold to their customers, which then produce other plastics. So they may have been impure in some way. They just basically got rid of them through pollution. They have a lot of pipes and waterfalls connecting between the plastics plant and the bay. So how do microplastics get into the environment? The main source of microplastics would be plastics production by things like Formosa Plastics. Microplastics can be pieces of plastic that are larger that eventually degrade into small pieces of plastic. This can be seen in the ocean as well. But all plastics degrade in the environment. They slowly break into smaller pieces. Could be due to them rubbing on rocks, wave action, and the sun has the ability to break down the plastics into smaller pieces. Most of the plastics that we use every year do get taken care of properly, but a decent margin of them do not. So 6 to 26% of plastics are recycled, and 21 to 42% make it to landfills. So that would be, 2/3 of the plastic. And the remaining third is basically mismanaged. It finds its way into environments and the natural world, but the main causes of it would be industrial releases of microplastics, which would be point source pollution, shipwrecks carrying microplastics. So Formosa Plastic makes these microplastics and then they're shipped to other areas to then make it to the factory and be used. Well, on the way, sometimes the ships sink or a shipping crate falls off them. That's another source of it. And then littering would be the last source. Why are microplastics pollutants for aquatic ecosystems? Well, it's because they're chemically synthetic compounds. They do break into smaller forms, which are then transported and deposited like sediments, so they have the ability to move very far from where they originally were put in the water. Then these plastic molecules can absorb into organisms such as plants, filter feeders, scavengers, and fish communities, and this leads to organisms' health being in jeopardy. And we'll get into how they actually affect the organisms in the next slide, but then they're also harvested for human consumption. So that's another reason why we should care about microplastics pollution in the aquatic ecosystems. So how are organisms affected by synthetic molecules? They are xenobiotics, which are foreign objects that interact with the cells of organisms, and they're generally unnatural. So the synthetic sawdust makes its way into the food web. I use that analogy because just like sanding a piece of wood, as you break down the plastic, it's gonna pretty much turn into finer and finer particles and then get distributed. Just like sawdust lands on the ground or gets inhaled by our lungs, it makes it into the organism's environment and eventually the organisms themselves. So ingested xenobiotics are broken down with food, and some of this gets absorbed, other parts of it get stored as fat tissue, but the parts that get absorbed are the most dangerous to the organism themselves. They can damage key components of the cells, enzymes, and cell organelles. They can alter DNA. So those would be what can happen to the organism itself. And then through bioaccumulation, organisms that eat the organisms that have stuff stored in their fat tissue and have altered cells are then eaten, and it accumulates in the organism that eats those smaller organisms. So why do the organisms matter? The biodiversity of the ocean is a very important topic, and as it gets degraded, it's one of those things that we're not going to get back. So maintaining it is very important. The ecosystem services of the ocean, gases being either trapped in the ocean or released by the ocean, or the interactions between plants and organisms is very important. So we want to maintain the services that, say, a coral reef does for our oceans. Um, we don't necessarily understand everything about our oceans, so it's important to stop damaging them. And the two factors that I'm going to dive into mostly would be human health and Texas marine industries and how they're affected by the microplastics pollution. So, Texas has a very large marine industry. It could be tourism, fresh food, recreation, and economic opportunity. The marine industry is basically the human use of the ocean and the bays as a natural resource. 8.5% of Texas's GDP comes from its marine activities, whether it's uh, well, this next slide will explain. Marine activities, recreational fishing, wildlife viewing, seafood processing, retail seafood business. All of these impacts are very important to local people and also everyday Americans who may want to visit Texas to enjoy some of its great businesses or natural resources, such as wildlife viewing and recreational fishing. So it's very important that we consider this marine activities industry when allowing plastics to be produced in the bays and along our oceans. This marine activities industry generates more profits for local people than the plastics plant does. The plastics plant has a salary of $135 million to the local people, and the Texas marine industries, by looking at this chart, you can see has far more of an impact. Now, the Texas marine industries is very far reaching. It's the ocean, so it's a lot of area, but basically the argument is that microplastics may affect marine activities, the fishing, the consumption of fish, the wildlife in the oceans, birds and marine species, and the pollution may reach a point where it starts to damage the marine activities industry. And that is the case that I'm trying to make, is that if pollution continues, it may damage these very important economic boosts for Texas as a whole. So, wildlife opportunities, Texas's GDP, continued ocean research, human economic and social benefits, and future generations and inspirations are my reasons to preserve the aquatic habitats of the Texas barrier islands and the oceans, inevitably the Gulf of Mexico. So, why does that relate to the original point? Is that the marine industries bring more money. They are a continuous resource. They have much more economic benefit on the local people of this area. And basically, it just allows for a healthier future. Eating contaminated fish is not healthy, so basically, the entire idea of limiting the plastics plant's pollution is to preserve and allow for a healthier future, whether it's the oceans being healthier or whether it's the humans interacting with the oceans. If one is healthy, the other benefits and is healthy. So, my position advocates that the potential impacts of the plastics plant may have negative long-term effects on marine industries, and although they have been polluting for a fair amount of time and we still have the marine industries to this day, it is not a guarantee that we will have as healthy of marine industries that we have today in the coming future if there's continued microplastics releases by the Formosa plastics plant. Um, I'm here to advocate that the value of the aquatic ecosystems should be considered when opening bays up to plastics production. I think that's fairly self-explanatory, but it's basically taking into account the marine industries, their economic impact, and their overall health, and considering that when introducing more industry in an area. And my solution to this problem would be that after each time they're fined for pollution, they experience a temporary 1 week shutdown to determine what went wrong and why, and what went wrong and what they are going to do in the future to stop it from happening again. And during this 1 week shutdown, it'll be a time of critical thinking and putting heads together. And although the plastics plant will not be making money and producing plastics during this 1 week, they should put forth a plan to not allow it to happen again in the future. And basically, the temporary shutdown is to penalize them further than the fine, because unfortunately, through a week's worth of work, the corporate benefits are way higher than the fine that they pay. So, say within a week, they might make $10 million and they have a $500,000 fine that they have to pay for polluting that week. In the end, the company still is making ends meet without any problems. And basically, if you shut down the plant or somehow find a way to pause their permit or something like that, I think that would be the motivational factor for Formosa to clean up their act. There has been no such act to take their permit away in any sort of way. They have been fined, but all production has continued. So, yeah, that was my presentation. I hope you guys found it helpful and interesting. And yeah, happy finals.